Good day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today I would like to address you in regards to an inviting message of peace, love, and unity. I have this concept that I keep in my mind up at the forefront of anything that I take in and consider, and it's this song that just repeats the ideal of peace and love and unity. And it's something that I feel is a compelling message for most people. There are some cynical minds that, hear these very simple, beautiful words, and their mind automatically takes it into a really dark place, and they reject the notion. The words are almost repulsive to them, and it's coming from a place of being harmed enough in the world and being shown enough of these examples in society where peace and love and unity just do not exist. They're not a part of the everyday. It's not the mainstream. It's not the norm. And so people consider these words to be frivolities or woo-woo or some, nice ideal, but that's not the way the world actually works. And, I really reject that notion because I know for my own life experience that these are very real and tangible things. And in fact, it is the realest and truest and purest way of being for humans. Our human experience, our human situation is deeply connected with, the ties that bind us in relation with one another. And more often than not, we seek to find a peace of mind. We seek to find the love, acceptance, appreciation, gratitude, and unification, somewhere to belong, a sense of belonging, and being a part of something that's so much bigger than you alone. And some people find that in the world, and other people have a struggle with that. The world isn't necessarily, it has not been that society has designed itself in the evolution of civilization, in its development, its advancement in these modern times to really allow for people to come together and, have the connections, the deep, real human connections where they get a sense of what is, unity, what is love, what is acceptance, and what's this sense of being at peace, having peace of mind, everything's all right. And it's because we don't create the atmosphere of experience, we don't create the paradigm by which we can involve ourselves with, why that seems to not be, the way things actually are. We have pocketed ourselves off into these life experiences that really keep us detached from, truth and reality, who we really are as individuals and as people. And they kind of keep the categories and faction us off into these isolate groups in these little silos, of conformity. And they say, this is where you fit, this is where you belong. And in that case, your rigid construct of, cultural identity, has you walled off from other people. And so the idea of, we all should just get along and connect with each other, on just the basic terms and conditions of respect. Those sorts of things become these hitches, or these things that become, repulsive, or that we have to reject it because our sense of, in order to fit in or belong in this way, we have to haughtily reject, something else. And that's really not the case. And we're so consumed with belonging in these silos and these, places of, that we've positioned ourselves with identity and within our culture and whatnot, that it has fallen to us with this sense that we can't, come together and really share any good common human experience. And, I know it's by design, and, there are a lot of bad actors with nefarious intent that really like capitalize on the fact that we are so separated, isolated, and factioned, because it keeps us distracted from the fact that, peace, love, and unity is really like our default way of being. When you see children playing together, they haven't been embedded with this sense of like isolate yourself in a group, and they just see one another as like, oh, let's explore, our existence in the world. And wow, there's another person here that is similar to me. Like, how can I learn from you and you learn from me? And oh, we can do things together. This is really cool. And then you grow as a human being because of the interaction and the relationship you have with others. And it's not until society tells you don't do it, don't do that, And we have this cultural mentality tries to say like, be yourself, be authentic. And then when you do that, society's like, not that way. When in reality, it's like, it's okay to be who you are as long as you represent what society tells you is normal or acceptable or tolerable and these sorts of things. And, I don't really buy into those notions. I really just think, as long as you're respecting somebody else's personhood, somebody else's identity, somebody else's personal dominion, you're not infringing on that or imposing your will upon somebody else, or your way of being is destructive or harmful to others. I really just don't think there's anything that, we should have conflicts about. Yes, there's going to bound to be misunderstandings, and there's going to be different interests that don't necessarily align with each other so readily or obviously. But, the only thing standing between two opposing sides is a misunderstanding of like, how do we orient with one another? How do we see ourselves as part of the collective, but maybe we don't fit in most directly, like perhaps there's, some separation or variance or some new orientation that we need to take in order for us to, fit in and belong. But, sensing that, you're not a part of somebody else's, world experience doesn't mean that you don't belong in the world and that you have to like reject who you are or hide who you are, pretend that you're something that you're not, in order to suit the sensibilities of somebody else. And, if you're not intentionally going out harming somebody else, imposing your will on somebody else, or forcing somebody else into submission, and, as long as you're really treating life as an exploration, of yourself, who you are, and how you relate with others, and how you are finding ways to be of service to others, like that's the most natural way of being. And that's your sense of, these ideal concepts of peace, love, and unity. And, anybody who rejects that or chooses to be like violent or predatory or extractive or, an exploiter, these types that are bad actors with nefarious intent, there's something about their worldview and their paradigm that is grossly perverted and distorted. They misunderstand the point of the exercise, like why we're here and what this is about, and really what we're doing together as a people to explore the vast potential of our highest ideals of becoming our, the best version that we can be. And it's unfortunate that there are so many bad actors that really just like spoil things for everyone else. And it's even more sad when those people like get some sort of like sick, twisted like pleasure that they derive, perverse pleasure they derive out of harming others. And that's why in the mainstream it seems ridiculous for someone to suggest that peace, love, and unity is our natural state, and that's what we should be cultivating with one another, and that should be the default way that we, engage and interact with one another. I always say it this way, like, I'm not asking everybody to hold hands in kumbaya. I don't think that we're going to like always get along, but there's a way to like get through our, struggles when we find that there's conflicts in interest. and do so in such a way that is, integrating the fact that we recognize that our orientations may not be able to be so direct, or, we may have to, compromise on some of our wants in order to find a consensus on the things that are going to suit the needs of, all parties involved. And the ideal about it, really truly represents to me this sense that, if we keep it just basic and simple, like peace, love, and unity, yes, they can be considered objective and subjective, but it's simple enough of a even playing ground that we can discuss what, delineates and defines and distinguishes peace, love, and unity, and come together on the terms and conditions of identifying that and recognizing that as the basis by which we start to establish relationships with one another. And then once we have that sense that, that's the type of outcomes we should be, deriving from our interactions and engagements with one another in our encounters, then we can start to find ways we can be of service and work together to accomplish great things. And, now more than ever, I really think we need to have that type of concept, because there's so much, vitriol and hatred and, lots of bad things that are happening in society in, the grand scale mainstream. And it's really starting to pollute the atmosphere of our experience. It's making us become, cynical and dark, and it's distracting us from staying united, and it's focusing us on how divided we are. And it's leaving us in this place of not being able to come to terms with the fact, we don't have to always get along. We have to find a way to get, where we need to go together without hindering, human progress. I always relate it back to this concept, I want to help America to become its highest ideal, which I believe is living up to its preamble promise, the preamble to the Constitution, and the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. The sense of, form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, and to respect that all people are endowed, with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that, the government is established for us to be able to work out the means by which we can create the American situation that fosters that type of progress and development and, institutionalization and formalization and cultural identity, establishing those deep roots and cultures based off of that sense of this is what it means to be an American. This is what it means to be in America. This is what we're about, what we're trying to work on together, in our own varied ways. But that sense of, we're all trying to come together to, make America work for everyone without the disadvantage of anyone, so nobody gets left behind or kept behind and everybody lives the good life. And to me, that's a sense of welfare and stewardship. And I always default back to this because it's this simple notion of that's how we embody the notion of peace, love, and unity. And it's really just that simple. And it gives us a sense of being able to identify the difference between right and wrong, a good actor and a bad actor, someone with positive intent, and somebody with nefarious intent, so that we can socially and civically engage with one another and socially and civically sanction one another to keep ourselves in alignment with what is, polite conversation and civil society. But things have been devolving because we've had a lot of people that have propped themselves up in prominent positions because they've been able to amass enough, money, wealth, power, influence, platform, you know, attention in the economy, to get people to look at them and say, like, oh, that person is, well known and established, and by, America's standards of success, they're successful. And so people look at them and say, those are the people you want to turn to and you want to seek answers from them because they have it figured out, right? But a lot of those people have gotten into those positions, by not so ethical means. And so they're really just sending a signal to people like it's okay to do these bad things if it gets you, what you want in the end, no matter who you hurt or harm in the process. And, we're cultivating that as an acceptable way of being in society. That's what we're formalizing. Our lived experience is formalizing and solidifying that as our social ontology. And so on one hand, we're saying, like, we shouldn't have violence, and we shouldn't have exploiters, and we shouldn't have abusers, and we shouldn't have, people who lie, cheat, steal, do harm to get their way. But then on the other token, we allow people to do that, and then we emulate them, and we platform them, and we project them as being, somehow, the ideal way of being because they have these weird, superficial meritocracy of like power, money, influence. And then people, lose sight of the things that are actually of substantial value. Having a good heart, an attitude and direction of your heart that is oriented towards, loving, respecting, appreciating, and having, unconditional loving regard and positive solicitude towards others. Like, these are the things that are of genuine value, but those aren't the things that can derive you, and generate income in society. You look at the ways that people draw incomes in society, and it's really hard to make your way in life if you're a good person, unwilling to compromise on soul print values, that don't want to reduce yourself to certain types of actions or behavior that would force you to compromise on your sensibilities of what's morally right or wrong, or your sensibilities of what really truly is of integrity and what is ethical and reasonable, right, fair, just. And I recognize, that's a deeply ingrained personal value. That's why I think I would make a really good public servant, because I'm not about the money, and I'm not about the gain and the what's in it for me. I'm more about, like, what can I give? That's what I value the most, and how can I be of service? Because to me, at the end result of what I put in effort to be of service to other is this capacity to stand back and look what I've accomplished that has helped to transform somebody's life in some way that they couldn't have otherwise done for themselves, or that they could have done for themselves, but they didn't, or, it was much more convenient for them to get assistance to accomplish something like this. And I was able to do it within my capabilities, my talents, and my skills. And I didn't look at it in terms of like how much time I invested or effort or energy, just knowing that I was being of service and being able to stand back and look at that and knowing, no small thing done poorly. Job well done. Good work. That to me is what is success. This is that sensibility. And to me, I really think that that's at the heart of all public service. You don't become a public servant so you can make some vast swaths of money. You just have a sensibility of like I don't want to make a difference in the world, in the lives of people. And like, I really don't want to see this type of, suffering or this type of struggle, and I want the system to be more functional, more operable, kind of like what I do when I see things, systems especially, inefficiency in systems, and I just want to like make everything super efficient. I want to lessen the burden of something that's like, if you just like insert mechanism here, you can automate a lot of those problems, innovate it out, and then people can be liberated from that struggle or that burden and be able to take risks for higher things. This is why I very much believe in automation. The frustration part about it is that our economic system is so broken that jobs is we're so desperate to hold on to jobs for people that we're afraid to embrace autonomy that could liberate us from having to, work jobs. It's not to say there won't be work for people to do still. Automation will help liberate us to take risks for higher things. And don't you see where that's like the fundamental breakdown of society? Like even the government like measures jobs report and it's like, see that's some sort of great indicator of success, and it's not. Just because somebody created a job or somebody, got a new job or, was able to retain their job, that doesn't necessarily indicate that there's, some sort of functionality in society that's doing a good thing. Yeah, you can say, well, that equates to person driving income, and that's a good thing, because people need to make a way of living and make a life, but it doesn't like translate to knowing that people are doing well and they're able to make their way in life without struggle or suffering or massive sacrifice. It doesn't indicate that people are thriving. And we really have an opportunity with technology to liberate ourselves so we can thrive. But we're in this like terrible position of people like holding on to the status quo of the past, not wanting to liberate people out of jobs because all they know how is like people have to work in order to drive income because that's just the way society's always worked. And I think it goes into this sense of like how we assert what values we have in society. If being of service and taking care of business and doing the right thing at the right time, the right way, for the right reasons, is really what our contribution should be all about. Really thinking about being of service. And that the end result of that should be, pride in work and esteem of knowing, no small task done poorly. But also knowing that as you contribute into society, we're really deriving a, reciprocal value. Like, it's coming back to us in the fold because as we give in, we're able to derive from. And it's no longer a question of how many hours did you put in, because, if you're working hourly wage labor pay, you will never survive in society, especially with the weird, breaking down of the economic system where, cost of everything is going up and people are being priced out of, basic bare necessities of life. And, there will never be a position in the current structure of the capitalistic society. Late stage capitalism has really like distorted the whole money making schema and is putting labor workers at the shit end of the stick, and they're getting screwed over and highly exploited for the work that they do, which ends up resulting in them doing like the bare minimum or not their optimum output, and society struggles and suffers from that. But beneath all of that, there's still functionality in the capital system, and people are deriving incomes and companies are growing, and so we call it success. I don't see it that way. when I look at capitalism, I look at as it's an inefficient system that needs to be optimized for, and it needs to be able to fully engage in the autonomous nature of work. And we need to embrace autonomy, but we also need to diverge from labor wages, and then reimagine what work is for people and how we derive income and our way of life. And we can do that by establishing a proper capitalism where it has a proper intended use. Like, we do these things for a reason, and it's not about putting profits at the core. It's putting people and planet and our paradigm at the core. Like, what's the point of the exercise, man? Are we enhancing the quality of life for people so that their lives are thriving and they're living life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and we're engaging the preamble promise and we're making that functional in the process, and that is part of the proper intended use? Are we making America work for everyone without the disadvantage of anyone, so nobody gets left behind, kept behind, and everybody lives the good life? That's what it's about. And you can't do that if you're screwing over the environments. People and planet, we are a symbiotic relationship with one another. We have to take care of each other. We take care of good Mother Earth, she's going to take care of us. We need each other, And then the paradigm that we live in terms of like what we deem is acceptable, how we choose to, align and attune ourselves. What is the attitude and direction of our hearts and our sensibilities? How do we, get on that same page with one another in terms of our outcomes should thus derive, a sensibility that's peace, that's love, that's unity, And once we kind of like embrace that, it can't just be, one function, one little tinker over here, like patchwork solution over here, or superficial policy adjustment there, or some, like, let's take it in this direction, but like forget all the other aspects of it. This has to be omnidirectional, dynamic application of a new way of orienting ourselves in society and with one another, and in a relationship with one another as a nation, as a people, in interrelationship with other nations and other people, and then, as planetary stakeholders, and really put ourselves in the paradigm of that sense of responsibility, and then to become the responsible party, take on extreme ownership of our part that we must play in making this all work. And once we can get on the same page of things, it becomes much easier for us to know what we have to do. And so I'm trying to find a way to like really bring this into the mainstream, the sensibility of like, it may seem pie in the sky or this crazy moonshot, type of ideal. It may seem like impossible because the status quo is so set up and so rigid and so formalized, but all of that is a human-made construct. And if you construct something, you can deconstruct something, and we can build something different. I don't think it's like, take in a wrecking ball and, pour a bunch of gasoline on everything, light a match, and let it burn. I don't see it as like destruction breeds creation sort of thing, in a sense we have to be like total, take things into total rubble and ruin and then build up in, the aftermath or something like that. I don't believe in that. I think in the destruction of, the paradigms and the models of reality that we're operating in, yes, because then it makes us look at something different. It's a great quote. I can't remember who it's by, but it's a quote that I read every day in my spiritual hunting, guidebook. And it essentially says that, I think it's by Wayne Dyer, and it says, change the way you look at something, and the things that you see will change. Does that make sense? So it's like how you look at something will determine what you see. Even though, like, it's another quote that I very much love and I read every day, and it's, you know, everybody may see the same thing that you see, but, is looking at the same thing, but they don't see what you see. And that's really about a mentality. It's your sense of paradigm. It's your perspective, your perception, your proposition and proposition within a space. And, that to me is how we choose to interact and behave with one another, is very much set on, our situational context, our historical context, and our fine context where we've been, brought into in our life experience. And so though we have grown up in this and this seems normal, this seems okay, this seems right, or, maybe not fair, but it's like, that's just the way it is sort of thing. We've been conditioned to think that the status quo is the normal, is the default. It's just the way things are, the way things have been, the way it has to be. But it's because we've grown up in that. We've been conditioned to it. We have been, bought and sold and, been propagandized with this sense that this is normal or this is, acceptable or tolerable, and it's not. When we start to break down those things and build up new models of reality, we start seeing things in a different light. And so you could be looking at the same exact thing that you saw yesterday, but you see in a different way today. And it's that shift in your paradigm, the shift in your sense of like what's there to be found, what's there to be discovered, what's there to be realized and understood, that helps you to start seeing the potential in things that maybe you didn't see otherwise before. And that's really what, our collective conversation is supposed to be about, is like trying to find a way to get all on that same page, at least with something of substance, like a keystone element, something where we can all touch stone and touch, as they call it, touch grass. This is reality. This is fundamental first principles, unchangeable truth, unfungible. And then from there build up a sense of, if we can break everything down to those brass tacks, that basic simple truth, and then rebuild up, new thought patterns, new sensibilities, new orientations, new paradigms, new associations, new tolerance points and acceptance limits and boundaries, then we start orienting ourselves in a different type of space. And then we can take the things that we already have and we can change the use of it, put it to a proper intended use, and discover for ourselves, like, this may be, the way things have always been, but we can now turn it into something new that actually suits the purposes that we would want, the intents and purposes of now, and the terms and conditions of the present tense. Befit the times. And then recognize that we're an evolving, changing society. I mean, it's even put into the founding principles of the United States of America. It says, like, ever more perfect union. That's people recognizing things change over time. Thank God. Nobody wants things to stay the same, especially when things are like, constantly in flux and, shifting and reorienting, and it's just chaos, right? But there's so much beauty in that chaos, because even in those things, what you're seeing, is vast potential that we can tap into, and we can, derive value from it, and we can shift things and start doing things in a different way in new orientations. But in order to do that collectively as a society, we need to have a large structure that we all collectively engage with and orient ourselves with the rest of the world. And that's really what government is supposed to be about, It's not control what you do, what you think, what you feel, what you can and what you can't do. No, it's like limits and bounds and associations, and regards for one another. Like, this is how we engage in civil society, guys. And we're trying to make sure we can retain, domestic tranquility, peaceful accord. We got to keep that, ever more perfect union going, and we have to have love for each other, love for our nation, the esteem, the pride, the prestige of America, being American, being an immigrant in America. Like, these are amazing things, and that's what we love. We love so much about this place and so much about each other's. Like, we're all in it together to make this place be, you know, a profound experience of, you know, something so special and unique, and a wonderful, brilliant offering to the world that has us distinguished from everywhere else, separates us apart from everyone else, but in a good way, right? And government's supposed to help us figure out that construct and help us assimilate it into our sensibilities of like, that's the limits of right and wrong. Oh, that's, you know, do unto others as you'd have them do to you. That's treating others as they want to be treated. That's adhering to the preamble promise. That's giving my talents in service to others. Like, that's the type of relationship we should really be affording one another and engaging with. And, you know, I mean, I've studied political science because to me it's highly fascinating, but I just have a really hard time integrating it in the way that people have been, you know, playing it out over time. To me, it seems like, you know, again, like it's this thing that is imposed upon people is how many politicians treat it, rather than this like sensibility of like how to fully integrate society, make it a fully integral system, orient, you know, the bounds and, you know, the opportunities and things like that, create goals and create structures and scaffolding to help build up momentum to achieve and accomplish certain things and keep everybody on the same page and oriented with the same storyline, and to foster that sensibility. Like, all of that should be what government accomplishes. But somewhere along the way, it got into this messy business of like creating laws to create limits here so you can create, you know, liberations over here so a few are benefited while many other are disadvantaged in this weird gross system of tribalism, and, you know, how to gain and amass power so you can attack and hurt other people, and then, you know, this weird system of like mockery and deriding and trolling and hating on and factionism and violence in the form of both physical, mental, and verbal, and it's, you know, and digital, and it's just gross to me. Like, I can't stand it. You know, many times I have to pull myself out of the political realm just because I find myself like, you get entangled in it, you know, and it's like it happens to even the best of us, you know. What is it? Like, one of my favorite song lyrics is, let's just face it, the world's fucking racist, and even the most peaceful of us gets caught up in the trend. And it's literally, that's the same kind of sense. It's like, it's so easy to get caught up in the trends of this like negativity and this, you know, violent political orientation than it is, it seems like that's the norm or something like that. It's not. You know, when I step back from those things, which I do often, I take respite from those sorts of things because it's such a toxification, and even worse by, you know, modern day politicians have really made things a nasty, nasty business. But pulling away from that, and then I, you know, come back to center onto who I am as a human being, as a person living this human experience, and, you know, loving everybody, respecting everybody, appreciating everybody with, you know, unconditional regard and solicitous gratitude. And I look at those people, you know, with a sense of pity and disappointment. It's like, gosh, you know, they could be doing so many good things in the world, and that's what they choose to invest their time, effort, energy, you know, and attention to. And it's just sad, especially because it ends up harming others. And it's like, you know, misplacing trust in these bad actors with nefarious intent is doing a lot of harm. And, you know, when I step back, I look at them as just like, it's going to be really hard for them to redeem themselves. But they really have no incentive to do so if society is, you know, incentivizing them to do that, you know, whether it's monetarily or they're giving them power or influence, capital, agency, resource, you know, things that they value. They're never going to change. and they don't care if you criticize them. The criticism is giving them energy that they like eat up like it's candy. They love it because it gives them the sense of like, my way of being gets so much on your nerves that all I have to do is just be myself and then I can fuck with you, essentially. And it's just like, there's no respect in that whatsoever. And so stepping back from it, I come and I touch grass on the touchstone of common humanity, and I look at the political realm and I'm just like, I want so much to change it. And I know that the best way to do that is to change it from within. But I'm not going to be able to do that as an individual by myself. I'm a brilliant catalyst, but I am, very well super concentrated, but not dynamic enough alone. I need, people to enter in that space with me with the same sense of orientation of like what we're going to be about when we go in and we change the system, is really helping it to evolve. We're, not breaking it down to brass tacks and building it back up again with the strength of integrities. Break it down to the integrity and build up more integrity on top of it so it can become expansive. And there will be a point in time where things get, out of bounds from even what we try to do. That's why nothing should be so permanent and immutable that it can't change. The only things that should be immutable are things of sincere integrity, and so you have to sometimes like build up the constructs and build up the laws and build up the rules and the norms and the orientations and the value systems in society. But then it will eventually reach a point and it's like, if things are not working for everyone, obviously it's not of integrity. Things are falling apart. So we have to break it down to brass tacks and then build it up again. And then every time we build it up and then we break it down, build it up, break it down, that the core of what we're working on will become more strengthened, more reinforced with the modern day interpretations of those base core fundamental first principles that have been proven over time as a consistent, a constancy, something that is of integrity that moves along a continuum with us, and that's how I see the dynamic systems of governance. And that's why it is so important that we have this, evolving and changing, system of, new people being elected and brought in, and all our laws really should be interpreted and oriented in terms of having sunset clauses, for uselessness and antiquatedness, or if they're, destructive in their ends or they're not conducive to, where we're trying to go now, they should be halted, and then we assume new ones. Sunrise for necessity, befit the times. Really what we have to get at right now is the sense that if we don't take a stance in this way and build up a scaffolding of supports to get us used to this new way of being, we're never going to really get there, because we have to adopt new models and patterns and a new ontology and foster that with intention. And our policy really has to be about helping us to relate with those new patterns. And laws don't always have to be punitive. I don't even like punitive laws. I like discipline, punishment and punitive things, are really self-defeating. Development and discipline and protocols and these sorts of things are developmental. They're evolutionary, they're positive. It's leading in a positive direction. Punitive is like constraining, and there's such a dark side to that, because it becomes, out of control. It's like, well, what's the limits of your capacity to constrain and to control? And then when you have the capacity to constrain and control somebody and force them into submission because you have the power of punitive, capacity, what is stopping you from going past the limits of what is even in that, punitive paradigm considered right or wrong? It's why we have a system of criminal justice where people are put into jails and prisons, and they are dehumanized and are living in substandard conditions, and there's a proliferation of violence, and people are being violated, and they're being mistreated, and they're not getting appropriate medical attention, and they're not getting fed healthy foods, and their entire human potential is being wasted, and they're being extracted for doing work for like basically pennies, and it's basically forced modern day slavery, and like that's the punitive system, and people make profit off of it, and it's a very lucrative business for people to decide that they're going to run these detention centers or these prisons and things like that. And it's really deplorable because those people and then the people that work for them have the capacity to abuse their power to submit and to be punitive, and the instances of that happening is far more often than it ever should be. But it's because these people left to their own devices with no real check and balance system, no real regulation. There can't always be somebody standing over them and watching them make sure they're doing the right thing at the right time, the right way, for the right reasons. Something in their mind's going to snap to think that it's okay because I have the power, and who's going to stop me? And then that punitive nature starts to evolve and warp and then become expansive, and then it distorts the minds of other people that are around it and see it. It's like, well, if that person can do it and get away with it, what's stopping me from doing it? And while there may be a limit at some point, and somebody may catch on, and there may be some sort of like corrective mechanism, but by that time, how many people have been polluted with the sense that it's all right to do the wrong thing? And you can see that in our political realm, where we have, people in these positions of power and authority. They're public figures. They're public-facing figures that are reflecting and representing. They're representatives of, the way in which government stands erect and props up the ideal of America. And these forward-facing, public-facing figures we're finding are, deeply corrupt. They're not following rules. They're being abusive and exploitive. They're extorting power. They're, extracting from the coffers of the American people because there's no one there to stop them. And they reflect on each other these terrible models of bad humanity. And it's like this whole mutually reinforced system of, mutual destruction. It's like, I'm doing it, and, you may be catching me do it, but you either join in or you get the hell out, and there's so much concentrated power, there's no real corrective mechanisms. Who's going to stop them? That was the whole point of having separation of powers, was to say, like, concentrated power tends to have a capacity to be corrupt. And that's why you have to have overlapping orientations of separations of power, so we can intervene and intercede on behalf of these different forms of power structures to make sure nobody gets too out of hand with their capacity to have power and leverage, because they understand the human tendency to see a way to get away with something, and they're going to push and test those limits. And if the individuals don't have a solid core structure of a sense of a soul print alignment of, the understanding right and wrong, having good moral fiber, a good sense of ethical bounds, their jurisprudence is well established and they cultivate it over time. If those things are not embodied in the person and who they are as an individual, it doesn't matter what platform or platitude or what party they're a part of, if they're not a good person and they're compromised, when they get in a position of power and they are compelled by a sense that they could get away with it, or they see other people getting away with it, left to their own devices, what are they going to do? And we see a lot of really bad things happening in government. A lot of exploitation, a lot of, poor stewardship of America's resources, going to essentially be these, funding the frivolities of a few people that are in positions of power, while the American people are suffering because the government is extracting taxes from them because, we have to pay taxes in order for governing, our collective system. But instead of that money being distributed in a return on investment type of innovation that improves the quality standard of the American situation for everyone. Instead, it goes to help to fund these extravagant, lavish, luxury things for the few people who have been able to ascend into the positions of power. And then those people shut the doors and turn off the phones, and they don't become responsive to the people. They close themselves in isolation, and then they cut off any accountability, and anybody that speaks out about them, they weed those type of people out. And when faced with questioning of, why does this seem corrupt as fuck? They essentially say, I don't see anything wrong here, as they cover their eyes to this, or, they just act ignorant about it, even though people are bold-faced telling them, well, that is wrong, what you're doing. Don't you think you should be more accountable, better stewards of taxpayer resources and American resources? And they have nothing to give except for excuses or changing the subject or ignoring, and there's always somebody to come in to step in to save their ass, because it's a mutually reinforcing system of self-destruction, mutually assured destruction. It's like, you all are either corrupt with us, or you don't belong and fit into this. And the system's slowly decaying, and and then our systems of society are starting to break down. Part of that is because those systems weren't integral, right, to our way of life. They were necessary, absolutely. Many of these things have been necessary, but they weren't integral. They weren't fully integrated. They weren't fully internalized. They weren't fully assimilated. They weren't fully structurally grounded and rooted in the substance of, the purest integrity of our nation, to the point where bad actors with nefarious intent can get in there and shift things around to skew schemas and rig it into their favor, funnel resources into their favor, diverging away from other people's resources, and nothing's stopping them, because they can say, we're not going to fund those sorts of things because we think it's more important to, spend trillions of dollars investing in the war machine, instead of spending, a few $1 million to help to engage systems of welfaring for the people, promoting the general welfare. And that's a value estimate on behalf of the people in power that have the capacity of leverage to, shift things into whatever direction they want. And they see this as a chance of man, I can ride, jets, I can go on vacations on the taxpayer's dollar, I can exploit, the Secret Service to, be my personal bodyguards. I can live in whatever places I want to. So much of this really bad corruption. And then the people that are in these positions, especially in the federal government right now, they just don't care is the baseline standard for all of them, and they especially don't care about you, It's all about them. It's about their crew, their cohort, their cartel-like government that they're establishing. But you, on the other side of the screen at distance, or you, just the average everyday American, you don't matter to them. They don't care about you. And so they're not thinking about you when they do stuff. They don't think about, as they take this plane trip and the cost of fuel is really high and it costs even more for them to go anywhere. They're not thinking about being frugal with that, or to consider, prudence and thrift. They're just we're not going to stop doing the things that we want to do. We're going to find whatever justification we need for it. And we're willing to cut off the bottom line somewhere else on the other side, where it usually means that some service to the American people is going to be cut off. That's the difference between them doing something to you and doing something for you. If they cared about you, they do something for you. Because they don't care about you, they do stuff to you. And usually what they do to you is they cut off the resources that helped you just to get along in society. But again, going back to the sense of these things weren't integral. They're getting cut off because they weren't embedded in our sense of this is just how America works in order to work for everyone. And because of that, we have this problem in society that has so many people that are being left behind or kept behind, and not having a, in essence, the idea is that, the way that government is currently being ran, the people don't care enough to make sure that the people are taken care of and that they're well established in their life. And it's because of this lack of care that a tremendous amount of Americans are struggling or suffering or, barely getting by. There are some people that are well off, but they could be doing so much better. Everybody could be doing so much better. If we intended for things to work for everyone. But it's really a matter of like how you engage with, this thing called governance, how somebody who comes in as a political figure and, works the inner workings of the systems of government to have them produce outcomes for the interest and the benefit and the securities of the American people and America's allies, and that really just comes down to who's in government and how they see government, and the people that are currently in government look at it as like, oh, this is a thing with a bunch of leverages and buttons and coffers, that we can plunder and we can push the buttons and we can skew the levers to pivot things to work for us. And that's what government's about, is like concentrating power and moving things to make things happen in a certain way, that's favoring the few people that have, funded enough in, some political party or, paid for some candidate or, political fund or whatever. It's never really about like seeing it as this whole dynamic system of being able to produce outcomes. When I look at governance and, political science, I look at it as an engineering, problem that needs to be solved. I look at it as this mechanization that is really very programmable, and that how you program it is going to determine on the outputs you get. And policies are how we program it. It's like the software for the hardware, and the hardware is like, the institutions and the government organizations and programs that we've developed over time, and those sorts of things are like being mistreated because the individuals that are in those positions don't care about their roles. They care about the power they have in those roles, and they do barely enough to make it seem like things are getting along, but they're dropping the ball in so many regards. They don't really know how to do the job because they don't care about the work, and so things are starting to fall apart, and very much in the current orientation of who holds the trifecta of power in, the three-branch system that we currently have in government. It's the Republican Party, which has been, invaded by this host parasite of MAGA that really has just fundamentally altered the entire composition and DNA of the Republican Party. It's not what it was, and I don't believe it will ever be able to go back to that. The best that can be hoped for is that it can detach this, foreign entity, and this like parasitic host, and start to heal and, mend itself and, evolve into something that is, better learned from the experience of what happens when it falls into dis-ease and disrepair and dysfunction, disorientation. And that is going to take a lot of time, and it will take intention. And I really hope for people that have the, spirit of the original spirit of intent of the Republican Party, will be able to come in and start to, heal and mend it and help it to evolve into something that is more positive and constructive rather than destructive. But I don't see that happening as long as we continue to, really say that it's okay, that the magnification of the Republican Party is something that we should accept as okay in society, because it really isn't. This entire movement lacks integrity. It's a demoralization of many of the people that align with it. It's leading people astray and deceiving them and making them operate off of false assumptions, false narratives. These people are being deceived, and it's bringing out the worst in them. And to be very clear, I believe the MAGA party, the MAGA movement really brings out the worst in everybody in society. But especially those who choose to align and orient and involve with it. It really brings out the worst in them. And the only way for people to heal themselves from that is to break free and, disassociate from it and really create some distance and to say, no, this isn't okay. And it's sad for the people that I see who are selling their souls to, this political movement that really doesn't have the best interest of everybody at heart. And seeing people compromise their values, people that once stood up with, erect spines of integrity, to sell that out and to abdicate their responsibilities and their roles in order to be, assimilated into and conformed within the parameters of what magnification, has become. It's really I feel pity and disappointment for those people. And I really hope for, on their personal day of revelation, when they wake up into the reality of they were living in an alternate, version of the world that was very distorted and not conducive to, what is, real, that they recognize how horribly wrong they were for misplacing their trust in people who were leading them astray from things that would have kept them in alignment with the types of, right orientations that we need to have with one another in a socially civic, cohesive society. It is impossible for unity to exist within the paradigm that MAGA is creating. Their entire assumption of their very existence is the creating of this internalized, deeply, ingrained and embedded rift that they are digging in hard in society. It's like a tick that is like digging its head in, and sucking the substance out of the nation, and you can't just pick off the body, it's never going to be fully detached unless we get the head out and we root the thing out completely, and even when we do that, we have to understand that thing probably, that tick of MAGA probably had Lyme disease, and now it's flowing within our system when we have to deal with it, and as much of a, weird metaphor that is, it's a sense that it's not healthy and it's not conducive to our well-being to have this, otherism, weird, parasitic type, MAGA movement that's hitched itself on to, the Republican Party and distorted what it was to make it what it is today, which is just this weird, grotesque, perverse thing that doesn't achieve positive outcomes and really brings out the worst in people and actually does more harm than it does good. And it certainly doesn't make anything great, because it's impossible to do great if you fail to do good. And move and diverge away from that. And it's important that we, really look at the mechanization of government, and the whole, point of, political science is about finding ways to, assume the very responsible necessity of figuring out what next needs to be done. I always look at government as, this engineering problem that is a living answer to the question, what next needs to be done? You know, and this sense of like, well, you know, who can take responsibility for it? Who is the responsible party in this regard? And we should all, at some point and in some way in our own, you know, specified talents and capacities and capabilities, raise our hand and say, I'm the responsible party. I take extreme ownership of that. I'm going to show up. I'm going to do my part. I'm going to help to make this work, because there's no way that, you know, any one of us can't do this alone. You know, it's the concept, I can't, but we can, you know. And then I look at the Democratic Party as just this very, it's like it was this once lush, beautiful fruit that like has slowly started to lose its luster, you know, and its substance is shrinking from itself. It's lost the point of the exercise a long time ago. And I don't believe that the Republican Party in its current form, or the Democratic Party in its current form, has the capacity to, you know, salvage America from this really terrible predicament that we're in right now. I believe that we need to have a responsible party. This is where I see, you know, the people who have been disillusioned from the Republican Party and disillusioned from the Democratic Party can come together and say, we're going to be the responsible party. We're going to all step up together, move in to the center, and we're going to orient ourselves with a sense that, like, we have to find a way to do this right, set things right, you know, that helps us to be able to, you know, move away from the far extremes of the political left and political right, you know, and really come into a sense of like, we have to be able to, you know, guide the nation with both wings. You know, we need to have the right, we need to have the left, but not so far an extreme where like the weight of things, you know, is at the far end of it. We need to have the weight come into the center and in that core structure. And then we need to depend on one another's capacity to, you know, keep things moving, you know. So we're not trying to make America into something where people in the right side of the political spectrum or the left side of the political spectrum, you know, can't exist in, you know, a cohesive way. You know, I think that the far extremes of either side is absolutely unacceptable, you know, but you're not going to stop those sorts of things from happening until you have enough of this sensibility that the core, the center, that's home, that's where we all belong. And that people start moving into it naturally, gracefully, intentionally, you know. And the reason why people go out to these far extremes is because there's no sense of belonging, you know, in the, like, there's no middle ground to belong to. There's no common ground, no place of, like, this is where, you know, we are all Americans, you know, at the very least. It goes back to what I'm saying about that touchstone, that keystone, that baseline fundamental first principles that we can orient ourselves with, that says, at least, at the very least, we can agree on this. We don't have that sensibility in society. I don't see any political party that is willing to accept that's really what we have to be about. And no matter which side, you know, you're batting for, there's this sense of like, you have to do it in extreme ways and you have to go all in with, you know, this way. There's no sensibility of like establishing consensus. And so things are being led astray. And that's why most people say it's not normal to say we should live in peace, love, and unity. You know, I'm looked at as this very peculiar person because I sense that that's what's right for America. You know, not political right, but it's the right thing to do. It's the right way of being. You know, and it just makes sense in my head, in my heart, because I'm not conflicted by these weird ideologies that are far extreme. And in my sensibilities, it's like, this isn't about, you know, some expedient fix, and it's not about some, you know, let's pass one policy and, gain an inch and, lose a mile on the other end, and the compromises that we have to make. Like, to me, it's like we have to create an entire sense of, like, being malleable, adaptable, mobile, efficient, sufficient, sustainable, steady, resilient in our course of intentionally evolving society and fostering that sensibility and creating a whole entire paradigm of an American situation that moves everybody along in that, And you don't achieve that if you are worried about your political alignments to a party, And so I can't associate with either party. If I had to choose, and I've been forced in this situation, it's usually the Democrat Party, because of the fact that they align with my sensibilities of the freedom and the liberty of personal dominion. I really believe that they haven't gotten that entirely, worked out in the kinks, and they haven't focused on it intentionally, but they are most receptive to the notion of personal dominion. But really, autonomous, self-sovereign, independent individual in which, it's an added ancillary protection of the individual in society, so the government can't come and interfere and interpose itself upon you. Which is weird because that used to be what I thought, the Republican Party represented when they tried to say we want small government because we want the government coming in and, imposing itself. No, they mean by small government, a few people have the concentrated power to dictate to all. And so you get these isolated few people with very small mindsets and very narrow worldviews, and you get very limited life experiences, and liberty is infringed upon, rejected, and denied. And so the only outcome, that is possible in that sort of orientation is tyranny and corruption, and an imposition of the subjective, submissive relationship of the government treating you like their property instead of the people who are the possessors of the power of government. And I get it because it's the sense of, like, with enough power, a single finger can overturn the world. And that's very much what I see the Republican Party working itself out to. Because it's easier to do that than it is to administer to a dynamic, diverse, wide, far-ranging, multicultural, multiracial, and, society. It's very hard to administer to that many, wants and needs and desires and tastes and aversions and interests and whatnot. But it's not out of the realm of possibility, and it's not impossible. It just takes a whole lot more work, which means you need to have a whole lot more people, more hands on deck to make things work. And that's where the Republican Party rejects the notion, because it's like, no, just a few people should be making all the decisions. Because letting everybody make the decisions, everybody's too varied in their decisions, you will never be able to find common ground. Well, I don't agree with that. I really believe we need to have a more direct democracy where people have more say in how the government operates. We should have a fourth branch of government that's another overlapping branch of government that helps to keep a check and balance on the other three branches. So you can't get a trifecta that ends up, pulling the whole nation far right when most people are not at all interested in going that extreme. And they start designing and orienting and creating policies that achieve outcomes that fulfill the wants and needs of a very few people at the disadvantage of everybody else. Government should be so that, we really can't make big moves like that without everybody being on the same page. We really should have a civics branch of government that involves all American people, and that's where we do consensus building, intentional consensus building. That's where we work out the kinks and have the dialogue and the debates about how do we establish consensus. you know, it is a collective political conversation and communication, and where we do problem solving, where we do debate, where we distinguish, define, and delineate, assert our values, assert terms and conditions, work all those sorts of things out together, and help to break it down to brass tacks in a sense of like everybody has to be able to find that touchstone, that keystone, that common ground. And from there, then we can say, okay, well, that's what's common. So now that's integral and that's integrity bound. So then we can establish laws, and legislate based off of the framing of the language of our laws to, orient with that sense that this is what we're integrating with. And it becomes the most natural process because people have already assimilated in their mind a sense of, I've already worked out what my relationship with this law is going to be, because I have been a relevant stakeholder at the table communicating what I believe, how this is going to impact me, how it's going to help or how it's going to hurt, where I think there should be limits and bounds. And we've been able to debate that on a public forum and been able to come to an agreement, a mutual interest, mutual benefits, mutual securities, mutual respect. Like, this is how we're going to do this, because this is the way that's going to be, we can all at least agree on that, and then move forward together and build upon that consensus. Even if it's a small thing that we can formalize consensus on, it's something that can have a profound impact because it's easy to assimilate because we've already agreed before it even became a law that that's what something we would want to have as a law, and then representatives and legislature can go and craft out the fine inner workings of what that language really, how it has to be put forth in order for it to be solid, tangible, legally adhering. It oriented with the Constitution, and then reflect back to the people, this is what we've come up with, and then reflect on our judicial system to say, like, how would this be interpreted? Because we want to make sure that it's going to be interpreted in such a way where it's not going to be perverted or distorted or end up giving us some negative outcome we wouldn't want to have. So everybody can be on the same page in a sense of like, this is the laws that we need, and this will serve on our behalf, and this is how we want them to be interpreted, so help us to keep in alignment with that. And then in the executive branch, they help us to execute those laws in such a way that keeps us in accordance. And we're all constantly keeping up the conversation to remind one another, public service announcement, just to let you know, this is our, social and civic ideals, and continuously reinforce that and inculcate those ideas. And the executive branch really has the ultimate responsibility to do that. Everybody has to be a part of it. Everybody has to positively, sanction and negatively sanction one another, keep within adherence. But the executive branch should really be helping us to be successful in realizing these laws in our daily lived experience, which also means sometimes you have to create policies that help to scaffold the means by which people can accomplish, the end state which that law was supposed to, enable. And, there's so much potential for government to work in that way, and I'm displeased with the sense that, that's not how it functions. There's disorder and there's chaos, and, I'm disappointed and pretty well pissed off that, the long-standing status quo of people in government before said, we couldn't make these big moves and these alterations and these changes because, it's impossible. Well, then you had somebody that was a total rule breaker and didn't give a fuck about messing things up in the form of MAGA that came in and just ruined everything. So it's, and things are not the way they were before. Laws, rules, norms, standards, ethical bounds, all of those things have been thrown out the window and distorted and dissolved, and we are not operating off of that operating system of that was standardized before. So it was not that it wasn't possible to change it. It was just that you were so, cling to the skirt of holding on to the status quo that you were unwilling to recognize that there was a necessity for change, and we had to do it intentionally, because things either change intentionally, designedly, or they, if for the better, or they change for the worse just by natural course of, things not of integrity eventually fall apart. And the MAGA movement very much represents the falling apart aspect of things. So, if other people that were supposed to be the responsible parties in the roles of government before would have just said, things are not working conducive to the well-being of everyone, we have to make some fundamental changes. There are, pits and schemas of corruption that have really distorted the functionality of the system. Things are getting out of hand in these ways. We have to start working for the best interest of people. We're going to make some alterations, but we're going to keep it, again, touchstone, keystone to these basic ideas, which again are represented in the preamble of the Declaration and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And essentially just say, that's where we have to bring it down to brass tacks. How we do it is really up to us, what we choose to implement in terms of policy. And we can establish laws and rules and norms, and it should really just be the basic sense of what's right and what's wrong. And be willing to be very, very public and transparent. This is a public conversation. Allow people to see as far into the inner workings of government as is possible so that they can trust in those systems. There's certain things that you can't blurt out to the world, because it's important that, things that are special in those ways really are not things you're meant to share. Because there's something so special about its capacity to, be opaque, that's how it's able to best optimize and be efficient and fulfill its role, and to do the right things to preserve and protect and defend the nation. But for the most part, we should be able to see the inner workings, and it should be a transparent process. It shouldn't be wasting time arguing about, pulling people into the principal's office of sorts to say, you were corrupt in this way, and we're going to put you in front of Congress. You're going to have to, talk to us and do some explaining. But in the end, nothing really changes. There's no teeth to change it. There's no actual corrective mechanism. And we need to change that. And those were the systems that they said we couldn't have before. That was the stuff we couldn't have, the transparency. We couldn't have the corrective mechanisms. We couldn't have a sense of relevant stakeholders at the table. The American people feeling that they have agency, capital, resource, they have stake in the game, skin in the game, and stake of claim in the nation. People couldn't have that because the government said it was impossible to do. I argue and beg to differ. We really can have a direct democracy where all people are brought into government and we involve together. That's how we build trust in the systems, and that's how we accomplish this sense of peace of mind. It's not competition, it's exploration. How do we overcome the past? How do we, metabolize the, harsh negative realities of what we were, and transmute it into, this sense of now we know what we must become. Given all of that, this is what we have to be about now. Moving on, moving forward, because we ain't going back. We never gonna again that. Who would want to, except for the few people that would have gains or benefits, or had gains or benefits from that rigged system. We shouldn't want for anything to go back to the way it was, because right now is the best time to be alive. Right now is the time, it's the moment, and moving forward, has so much potential to become better, because we can put the effort into making it better. And that's what we should be about. And we should want everybody to be a part of that process, because then it's natural. When you sense that I have agency, capital, resource, stake, skin in the game, like seat at the table. You're being listened to, you're being heard, you're being valued, you're being considered, you're being understood, you know, and your voice is being integrated into the whole conversation that we're having together, so we can bring it into that, you know, all around the nation, same song that we're singing, you know, and it resonates, a sense of like, this is America. The American identity stands for this, and we all get it, you know, on lock-in. We may have different, you know, versions of it and tastes, but it should come down to that brass tacks. And to me, a lot of what we're facing right now in troubles and in perversions and corruptions and, you know, distortions and a lot of violence and stuff is just really a result of our sense that, you know, we don't seem to have the great goals in common. We don't know what's the point of the exercise, what's the purpose, why are we here, you know? And that's why I really think that creating that sensibility of a reason, you know, there's a reason why we're this way. And the reason why we're this way is because we're trying to get at something together. You know, we're trying to achieve a fulfillment, you know, and it's not like it's an end point. We're not seeing an end to things and we're trying to get to the ends. We're trying to create outcomes so that when we arrive at the results of our good work and efforts, we can reap in the benefits, you know, of what we sowed before. It's like, yes, this is awesome, great. Now we can take risks for higher things because we liberated ourselves from the problem complex that we found ourselves in before. And we're like, this needs to be solved. And we get to work solving it. And then we solve